After Jesus' death and resurrection, and before his visible ascension, he appeared several times to his disciples. I want to read what he said on one such occasion when he appeared to them. And you find it in Luke chapter 24, Luke the 24th chapter, and beginning in verse 44. Then he said to them, "These are the words which I spoke to you while I was still with you, that all things must be fulfilled which were written in the law of Moses and the prophets and the Psalms concerning me." Now he's talking about the Old Testament scriptures, the law of Moses, the Pentateuch, the Torah. He's talking about the prophets, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, the minor prophets, and so on, the Psalms. And he says that he wants them to understand all things that these books said concerning him. You know, and that's a subject we could spend many, many hours on. We could explore for the rest of this day and many other days to follow. So much in the Old Testament, it reflects, not only do we find direct prophecies about Jesus Christ, but we also find indirect statements about Christ. And it was only after the Christ event occurred that we're able now to look back at some of those passages and see how they actually pointed forward to Jesus Christ. For example, who would have ever connected the Messiah prophesied in the Old Testament with the Passover lamb? Until after Christ came, and now we see the connection there very clearly, don't we? Perhaps we would never have connected the events of the Day of Atonement, the atonement ritual, the high priest going into the most holy place and offering the sin offering for the sins of the people until after Christ comes. And now we look at the book of Hebrews and we see that indeed it was recognized very early that all of these passages back there did pertain to the Messiah. So this light of truth came when the Messiah actually did come. He goes on to say, verse 45, "And he opened their understanding that they might comprehend the Scriptures." And you see that reflected throughout the New Testament. It is very clear that the understanding they had by the time they wrote these books that make up our New Testament, that their understanding was much greater than it had been when they were disciples in the earthly ministry of Jesus. Their understanding was enhanced, and indeed, as we look through the New Testament, we see reference after reference, sometimes direct quotations, sometimes indirect, sometimes allusions or echoes of passages right out of the Old Testament. From the law, the prophets, and the Psalms. You see it everywhere. But today, I want to focus on one such passage, only one passage that is used in the New Testament. It's quoted directly from one of the prophets, and it is applied directly to Jesus. And I want to deal with this one because it has been said that this particular one, quoted in the New Testament, namely in the book of Matthew, in Matthew chapter 1, it has been said that Matthew was either ignorant or he was a liar for using this particular text and applying it to Jesus, that actually applied to a situation hundreds of years before the coming of Jesus and not to Jesus at all. Well, we'll explore that today, and we're going to conclude that, in fact, there are elements of truth in that claim, that is to say, the claim that it applied to a situation hundreds of years before the coming of Jesus. But we're also going to see, hopefully I'll be able to demonstrate this to you before the day is over, or before this hour is over, to give you a little clue as to it's not going to go that long. But hopefully I'll be able to convince you that not only is Matthew not ignorant, not only is not a liar, he is a brilliant theologian, and he understood the Scriptures very clearly. So let's go back to that prophecy that I'm referring to. You will find it in Isaiah, the 7th chapter. The specific verse we want to look at, and we're going to look at it more carefully in its context in a few moments, Matthew chapter 7, verse 14, "Therefore the Lord himself will give you a sign. Behold, the virgin shall conceive and bear a son, and shall call his name Immanuel." Now this is the passage, the scripture, that Matthew uses in Matthew chapter 1, and he applies it to Jesus. But what I want to do today, I want to look at this verse in its proper historical context and see if we can determine what was actually going on and what this verse originally pertained to. Let's go back to the first verse in chapter 7 and begin reading and see if we can piece together a picture here so we can understand this in its context. Chapter 7, Isaiah 7, verse 1, Now it came to pass in the days of Ahaz, the son of Jotham, the son of Uzziah, king of Judah, that Rezin, king of Syria, and Pekah, the son of Remaliah, king of Israel, went up to Jerusalem to make war against it, but could not prevail against it. Now what was going on here? You see, what was happening here is that the northern kingdom of Israel, the king of Israel, was in alliance with the king of Syria, and the two of them opposed the Assyrians. That was their enemies. And in order to recruit Judah, the king of Judah, Ahaz, the king of Judah, to be on their side in opposing the Assyrians, well, they sought that. And this is why they were waging war against them, trying to convince them to join them against the Assyrians. But Ahaz had what you might call a pro-Assyrian view of things, a pro-Assyrian policy, because he sought Assyria's help in preventing this invasion from the northern king of Israel, who was in alliance with the king of Syria. So that's the context there. So Ahaz was in fact, there had already been some invasions. There had already been conflict. And Judah had suffered greatly because of it. And so Ahaz and the people of Judah were in fear of the king of Israel and the king of Syria. They lived in fear of this. It goes on to say, verse 2, And it was told to the house of David, that would be Ahaz, he was a descendant of David. He sat upon the Davidic throne. It was told of the house of David, saying, Syria's forces are deployed in Ephraim. Ephraim refers, of course, to Israel, the northern kingdom. So his heart and the heart of his people were moved as the trees of the woods and moved with the wind. Then the Lord said to Isaiah, Go out to meet Ahaz, you and Shear-Jashub, your son. And the word actually means that this odd expression means the remnant shall return. And what it is, the reason he sends his son with that name, meaning the remnant shall return, with him, because it has contained within it a message of hope to the faithful. The remnant shall return. The remnant shall have God's protection. Even though some bad things are coming, even though times of destitution, times of hard times are coming, nevertheless, there is a message of hope there. So he takes his son with him. It says, at the end of the aqueduct, from the upper pool on the highway to the fuller's field, and say to him, Take heed and be quiet. Do not fear or be faint-hearted, for these two stubs, or these two smoldering stumps, as it says in some translations, smoldering stumps. What do you mean by what does that mean, do you suppose? It's an indication as to what's coming upon them. He's talking about the king of Israel and the king of Syria in alliance. These two smoldering stumps. You know, that's not a good thing, is it? You have a couple of stumps. The trees have been cut down and the stumps are smoldering. These two stubs are smoldering stumps of smoking firebrands for the fierce anger of Rezin and Syria and the son of Remaliah. Talking about these two kings and the nations they represent. Because Syria, Ephraim, and the son of Remaliah have plotted evil against you, saying, Let us go up against Judah and trouble it, and let us make a gap in its wall for ourselves, and set a king over them, the son of Tabeel. We don't know exactly who that is, but it's not a Davidic king. So what they're saying is, we're going to go punch a hole in your wall, we're going to invade you, and we're going to remove you from office and replace you with a different king. Now, in the backdrop of this is God's promise to David, the Davidic covenant, that, no, you're not going to do that. In God's message here to Ahaz. Now, keep in mind, though, that Ahaz was not the best king that Israel ever had. Ahaz did permit idolatry. He did permit idolatrous worship. He permitted the abominable practices of the Moabites in his land. And so he was not the best king that Judah ever had. However, God here is going to support him and Judah against the invading forces. And so what God says here is, it's not going to happen. He's telling Ahaz, don't fear, because what they're saying they're going to do is not going to happen. You see, his promise to David is at stake here. He goes on to say, thus says the Lord God, it shall not stand, nor shall it come to pass. For the head of Syria is Damascus, and the head of Damascus is Rezin. Within 65 years, Ephraim will be broken. Now, this is 65 years later, but however, some other bad things are going to happen in the immediate future, so that it will not be a people. The head of Ephraim is Samaria, and the head of Samaria is Ramaliah's son. Now he says, if you will not believe, surely you shall not be established. I like the way the English Standard Version puts this. It says, if you're not firm in your faith, you're not firm at all. In other words, you need to believe what I have spoken to you, Ahaz. You need to believe it. I am not going to let these two kings invade your land and bring the destruction that they claim they're going to bring. They're not going to throw you off the throne. Your successor, Hezekiah, will, he doesn't say that here, but we understand through history that that's what happened. He will take the place upon the throne of his father David after you. So God promises him that what these kings want to do is not going to happen. Now, this is the context. This is the context in which we find the prophecy in chapter 7 concerning a certain sign. Well, let's read on down to it. In verse 10, it says, moreover, the Lord spoke again to Ahaz, saying, ask a sign for yourself from the Lord your God. Ask it either in the depths or in the height above. What does this mean, a sign? Well, God has made a promise, and now he's saying, look, just ask a sign to confirm that promise. In other words, suppose a prophet comes to me, gives me a promise, says God has said this, and it's sure to come to pass. Now he said, look, ask for any sign you want. I'd said, okay, the sky is going to be green tomorrow. I'd probably come up with something like that. Or, okay, clear away all the clouds from the sky and cause it to rain anyway. You know, he says, ask for a sign. I will give you a sign to confirm the promise I have given to you. What does Ahaz do? Well, look at it, read it. He says, Ahaz said, I will not ask, nor will I test the Lord. Now, you know, it's a good thing not to put God to the test. But when he asks you to ask for a sign, it's a good thing to go ahead and do it. Ask for the sign, but no, he won't. In his perhaps his arrogance, perhaps his hypocritical mode, he doesn't ask for the sign. Then he said, meaning then the prophet said, Isaiah said, hear now, O house of David. Here's that expression again, house of David, referring to Ahaz, who was the Davidic king. Hear now, O house of David. Is it a small thing for you to weary men, but will you weary God also? So since he won't ask for a sign, okay, here's a sign for you. That's what he's saying. Therefore the Lord himself will give you a sign, and here it is. Behold, the virgin shall conceive and bear a son, and shall call his name Immanuel. Now, a couple of things need to be said here. First of all is the word translated virgin. You go to most commentaries and you will find that the Hebrew word simply means young woman. And many scholars, people who know Hebrew better than I do, would argue that the word does not technically mean virgin. It simply means young woman. You'll find many Orthodox rabbis making that argument. Now you say, okay, well Matthew was quoting from the Greek Septuagint, and this is something else you will find in just about every commentary you pick up, in the notes, in study Bibles, and articles and so on this subject. They say the word in the Greek, though, does mean virgin, or at least strongly implies it. And then you have someone like, say, Rabbi Singer. How many of you are familiar with Rabbi Singer? He's an apologist for Orthodox Judaism. He comes along and he looks at the Greek word and he says, hold your horses. No, it can refer to a woman who is not a virgin. And he shows examples of it. Now again, I'm not a language scholar. I have to depend on what language scholars tell me. Hebrew and Greek, and I'll say this now. I'll say this and I'll come back and hopefully be able to explain this to you later. I don't care whether it means virgin or not. I don't care. I don't care Doesn't matter with me. Doesn't matter at all, and I'll tell you why it doesn't matter a little bit later. You know, those who make the case that it does mean virgin, okay, that's fine, maybe it does. Maybe the Greek term does. Those who make the case that it doesn't mean, I'll say, okay, that's fine too. That's fine too. Maybe it doesn't. Maybe they know something I don't know. Maybe they know something the other scholars don't know. But I'll leave that up to the language scholars. In the meantime, I can tell you that it doesn't matter to me, because it does not change Matthew's intent when he uses this passage, as I shall show you later. The other thing here is the name Immanuel. It means God with us. God with us. And the other item that I might mention is that, keeping in mind the context, we might ask the question legitimately, how is it that this sign of something that's going to happen in the immediate future can be applied to something that took place hundreds of years later in an entirely different context? How's that possible? Well, we'll see how it's possible a little bit later. But for now, let's understand that this really was a sign given to Ahaz to confirm that God would not allow these two kings to invade his land and bring the destruction that they said they were going to bring. He's going to use the Assyrians to punish this people and to put a stop to the program of these two kings, as we shall see. He goes on to speak, in speaking of Immanuel, this child who is to be born, he says in verse 15, curds and honey he shall eat, that he may know to refuse the evil and choose the good. Now this is another one of those questions that come up, and people have various answers for it. What does it mean, curds and honey? Well, some people say, oh, that's talking about baby food. That's before he can eat, solid grain food and things like that. And to that I would say, no, that's not what the context is really about. Others say, oh, well, curds and honey, that's milk and honey. Land flowing with milk and honey. It refers to the prosperity of Israel. Oh, no. Doesn't fit the context either. If you read down a little bit later, we'll skip over some part of the scripture and come back to it, part of this text. Down in verse 21, it says, it shall be in that day, this is talking about the day of the Assyrian invasion, that a man will keep alive a young cow and 2 sheep. So it shall be from the abundance of milk they give that he will eat curds, for curds and honey everyone will eat who is left in the land. This refers to a reduction, not an increase, but a reduction of the standard of living. Because you don't have the grain, you don't have the harvested fields, you have curds and honey for a temporary period of time. A reduction in the standard of living. And this is in the wake of the coming Assyrian invasion, which not only devastated the northern kingdom, not only put a stop to the threat of those two kings, the Syrian and the king of Israel and the king of Syria, but also had a profound effect on Judah and Jerusalem. Because the Assyrians had the dominance, and they had to make major adjustments. So there was a period in which the people had curds and honey, meaning a reduction in the standard of living. That's what it's referring to. And this applies to the land of Immanuel, to the people of Judah. Now back to the text in verse 15. Again it says, curds and honey he shall eat, that he may know to refuse the evil and choose the good. In other words, when you're in that kind of situation, if you're relying on God in that situation, then it has a character-enhancing aspect to it. It goes on to say, for before the child, this shows how quickly this is going to happen. For before the child, that's Immanuel, shall know to refuse the evil and choose the good. In other words, before he comes to an age of accountability, he's still a small child, before he comes to an age of accountability, the land that you dread will be forsaken by both her kings. That's not something hundreds of years later, is it? That's something that's going to happen right away. Immanuel is still going to be a small child, not yet having reached the age of accountability, whatever age that is. It's after a few years at least. But in any case, Immanuel will still be a child when these two threatening kings are dealt with by the Assyrian forces. So again, I ask the question, how in the world can Matthew use this text and apply it to Jesus, who came all the way out into the Roman period hundreds of years later? You know, Ahaz ruled from 735 to 715. This invasion that he's talking about here was in about 722, I believe. In any case, this is talking about an ancient time, long before the coming of Christ. Well, we'll get to that, but let's go on with this text here and see if we can determine who this Immanuel is and how it was that this came to pass. Well, he goes on in verses 18 through 22 to describe this Assyrian invasion. This is this Assyrian invasion that would result in the people eating curds and honey. In other words, a reduction in the standard of living. We won't read the entire section there, but let's drop on down to verse 23. It says, "It shall happen in that day that wherever there could be 1,000 vines worth 1,000 shekels of silver, it will be for briars and thorns. With arrows and bows men will come there, because all the land will become briars and thorns. And to any hill which could be dug with the hoe, you will not go there for fear of briars and thorns." So this is not a very pleasant situation, is it? This is not a land flowing with milk and honey. It's talking about a time when there's a reduction of the standard of living, and the prosperity that Israel once had will no longer be there. Now then, who is the Immanuel? Who was this Immanuel, the person who fulfilled this prophecy in the time of Ahaz? That too is subject to a range of interpretations. There's one interpretation that says that the virgin that shall conceive is not any one particular individual, but what he's saying, what the prophet is saying to Ahaz. This is one interpretation. By the way, I don't agree with it, but this is one interpretation, and that is that this virgin who will conceive and give birth to Immanuel really is a symbol for many different young women in the land. And what he's saying is to look around Ahaz and see the births that are taking place. And let this be a sign to you that God has not forsaken Judah. Now, that kind of makes sense in a way. But again, I can't buy it. I think that's reading a little bit into it. It's making some assumptions that can't be really supported. There's another interpretation, and actually this is the one I used to favor, but I don't anymore. You change your mind over time. One is that since this is to the house of David, specifically to Ahaz, and concerns his throne, that this is reference to Hezekiah. The problem with that, well, actually, this was the favored interpretation of some of the Jews back in the 2nd century. But then when Jerome came along later, he took a look at it and said, nope, can't be Hezekiah, because Hezekiah was already born by the time this prophecy was given. And yet then other scholars have come along and said, well, you have to understand that those dates that we traditionally attach to certain events in ancient times are just points of references. They're not exact. So it may be that Hezekiah was not yet born when this prophecy was given, and it does pertain to him. That's a favorite interpretation of many. And it kind of makes sense, but I don't think that's what it's talking about. The reason I don't is because the prophecy, which extends, by the way, through chapter 11 or into chapter 11, talking about the same set of events, but the prophecy actually tells you or gives you a very strong, at the very least, a very strong clue as to who Immanuel was in the time of Ahaz. And you read about it in chapter 8. Read about it in chapter 8. It says, verse 1, "Moreover, the Lord said to me, take a large scroll and write on it with a man's pen concerning Mahar." I think the correct pronunciation is Maher-Shal-Al-Hashbaz. That's not something. It's not a name you hear every day. Maher-Shal-Al-Hashbaz. And that name, by the way, means quick to plunder, swift to spoil. So write on it the name of Maher-Shal-Al-Hashbaz. He says, "And I will take for myself faithful witnesses." Now understand who these faithful witnesses are. They're apostates. Ahaz himself was an apostate king. It says, I will take for myself faithful witnesses to record. Uriah, the priest, and he was an apostate priest, and Zechariah, the son of Jeberechiah, and evidently he was a false prophet. So here I'm going to, for the benefit of this apostate king, Ahaz, I'm going to take an apostate priest and a false prophet as a witness. So what's he saying here? I'm going to force them to participate in the sign. And this sign concerns Maher-shalal-Hashbaz. Now then, who was Maher-shalal-Hashbaz? Let's read a little further. Verse 3, Then I went to the, this is Isaiah speaking, I went to the prophetess, that would be his wife, and she conceived and bore a son. Then the Lord said to me, Call his name Maher-shalal-Hashbaz. Now that begins to sound a little bit similar to the Immanuel prophecy, doesn't it? She shall conceive and bear a son. Now notice this in verse 4. Verse 4, it says, For before the child shall have knowledge to cry, My father and my mother. In other words, while he's still very small, the riches of Damascus, that's a reference to Syria, and the spoil of Samaria, a reference to Israel, will be taken away before the king of Assyria. That says the same thing that verse 16 says when it says, For behold, the child shall know to refuse the evil, before he knows to refuse the evil and choose the good, before the age of accountability, the land that you dread will be forsaken by both her kings. So there you have the fulfillment, I would say, of the Immanuel prophecy. It is in this child who was born to Isaiah the prophet, whose name here is Maher-shalal-Hashbaz. Now let's read on and see that that's not the only name that is given to him. That's not the only name. It is the name that has significance to the enemy. But there's another name he has that has meaning to Judah, and especially to the faithful. And that name, by the way, is Immanuel. God with us. That's what it means. God is with us. So to one group of people, it means, his name means quick to plunder and swift to spoil. And that's what's going to happen to Israel and Syria. To another group of people, Judah, and particularly to the faithful among them, his name is God is with us. Same person. Two names, same person. Goes on to say, The Lord also spoke to me again, saying, this is verse 5 and verse 6, Inasmuch as these people refuse the waters of Shiloh that flow softly and rejoice in Rezin and in Remaliah's son, that's those two kings, now therefore, behold, the Lord brings up over them the waters of the rivers, strong and mighty, the king of Assyria in all his glory. He will go up over all his channels and will go over all his banks. He will pass through Judah, not without effect. You know, Judah basically is a vassal to this Assyrian king. He will pass through Judah. He will overflow and pass over. He will reach up to the neck, and the stretching out of his wings will fill the breadth of your land, O Immanuel. Still talking about Maher-shalal-Hashbaz. Same person, same one, same child. And then it says, be shattered, O you peoples, and be broken in pieces. Give ear, all you who are from far countries. Gird yourselves, but be broken in pieces. Gird yourselves, but be broken in pieces. Take counsel together, but it will come to nothing. Speak the word, but it will not stand, for, listen to this, God is with us. The meaning of Immanuel. So this child is a symbol to one group of one thing, God is with us. To the other group, he's a symbol of of how quickly the plunder and the spoil will come upon them. Quick to plunder, swift to spoil. Now, so I would say that here you have the fulfillment of the Immanuel prophecy. But once again, I ask the question, how can you apply that to Jesus, since you see very clearly it applied to Ahaz? Well, there may be a couple of indicators in the text itself. Two things I want to call your attention to. The use of certain terms in the prophecy itself. Actually, three things. That's the first thing. The second thing is we must keep in mind the promise God made to David. His dynasty was not to end with Ahaz. It was not to end with Hezekiah. It's an everlasting dynasty. So that you know that there's coming other Davidic kings. And specifically we understand another Davidic king, the ultimate one. But in any case, we have to keep that in mind. And then the third thing, well, I said that there's the language, the use of language, the fact that this God's promise to David, the Davidic covenant, and then finally the nature of prophecy itself. The nature of prophecy and how this, beginning here in chapter 7, we read to chapter 11 and you find the same thing being discussed. However, you will find, as it describes the coming invasion of the Assyrians, he also talks about, for example, in chapter 10, how that he will punish arrogant Assyria. So he's going to use the Assyrians to punish Israel and Syria, and then he's going to punish the Assyrians themselves because of their arrogance. And he goes on to talk about the returning remnant and other things that relate right back to the very situation we find described in chapter 7. So that's the third thing to keep in mind. Chapter 7 through chapter 11 speaks of the same historical set of circumstances, but as we shall see, also looks beyond it. Also looks beyond it. Those three things are very important to keep in mind. So now then, look at the wording here. Look at the wording first of all. As I pointed out already, it says, then he said, verse 13, chapter 7, verse 13, then he said, hear now, O house of David. Ahaz was the head of the house of David at that time. But the very fact that this prophecy is not just to, is to the house of David could imply that it looks beyond Ahaz. And we'll see a little more evidence of it in the next verse. It says, therefore the Lord himself will give you a sign. You see the word you in Hebrew? It's plural. Ahaz was a single individual. But when he's speaking to the house of David, he's saying, look, house of David, I will give you, more than Ahaz, you see it extends beyond Ahaz, you a sign. So this sign function, it is possible from this alone to, at least as a suggestion, that the sign could apply elsewhere in the history of the house of David. Okay, that opens the door right there, just the language alone. Now, again, as I mentioned earlier, the Davidic covenant. The Davidic covenant, God's promise to David. It was not to end with Ahaz nor with Hezekiah, but was to continue on. And their scriptural indication, of course this is what the people in Jesus' day were looking for, was that ultimate Davidic king who would come on the scene. Restore Israel, reach out to the rest of the world. And of course we're talking about the kingdom of God. And we apply that to Jesus Christ. As I said earlier, the prophecy continues. And even though there is a child named Maher-Shalal al-Hashbaz, also known as Immanuel, who's described here in chapter 8, I want you to read a little further and realize that that's not the only child that is mentioned. In chapter 9, we'll take it up in verse 6, it says, for unto us a child is born. Still talking about the same thing. Still has the same context in mind. Unto us a child is born. Unto us a son is given. And the government will be upon his shoulder. And his name will be called, and I'm going to read his name, and you tell me if this sounds like the name Immanuel, the meaning of the name Immanuel, which is, of course, God with us, or God is with us. His name shall be called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace. Does that sound like God is with him? and that through him, through this Davidic king, this child, that God is with the people? Yeah, it does, doesn't it? I don't see any other way around it. Of the increase of his government and peace there will be no end. Upon the throne of David, and over his kingdom, to order it and establish it with judgment and justice, from that time forever, or that time forward, even forever, the zeal of the Lord of hosts will perform this. So I would say then, based on this, given the context, you look back at the Immanuel prophecy, not only did it apply to Maher-shalal al-Hashbaz as a sign to Ahaz, but it has the function continues beyond that to the house of David down the road, and it appears again later in this child, whose name is called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, and so on. God is with us through him. And then the story continues. Again, chapter 10, as I mentioned earlier, Assyria's arrogance is referred to and how Assyria will ultimately be judged. And then it takes us right on through the returning of the remnant, which is suggested in the name of one of Isaiah's sons, spoken of earlier in chapter 7. And chapter 11 takes us again to a child. It doesn't mention child, but it implies it. Chapter 11, there shall come forth a rod from the stem of Jesse, or another way of translating this, there shall come forth a shoot from the stump of Jesse. Now, you've been in an area where the forest has been cleared away. All of you have seen stumps. You know what a stump looks like. Have you ever noticed a stump? Could be one in your backyard. And you go out one day and you notice there's this shoot rising up out of it. Well, this is what he's describing right here. And what he's saying is this shoot starts small, like a child, but it's eventually going to grow. It's going to become a tree. So a shoot rising, he sees a shoot rising from the stump of Jesse, and a branch shall grow out of his roots. The Spirit of the Lord shall rest upon him, the Spirit of wisdom and understanding, the Spirit of counsel and might, the Spirit of knowledge and of the fear of the Lord. And it goes on to describe him, what he's going to do. His delight is in the fear of the Lord, and he shall not judge by sight of his eyes, nor decide by the hearing of his ears, but with righteousness he shall judge the poor. In other words, if you read the whole section, you'll see that then in this person, God will be with the people. God with us. Immanuel. So the Immanuel prophecy looks beyond its immediate fulfillment. No question about it. It did have an immediate fulfillment in Maher-shalal al-Hashbaz. I don't think there's any question about that. It was an immediate sign function for Ahaz. However, its definitive fulfillment is in the child described in chapter 9 and verses 6 and 7. Its ultimate and definitive fulfillment is found there. We like to call that duality, but that's a simplified way of speaking of a broader prophetic principle. And it should teach us how we are to approach biblical prophecy. So now then, I ask the question, was Matthew a liar? Was Matthew a liar? Did he know what he was talking about when he applied this passage to Jesus? Well, let's read it in Matthew chapter 1. It says, now the birth of Jesus, verse 18, the birth of Jesus was as follows. After his mother was betrothed to Joseph, before they came together, she was found with child of the Holy Spirit. Then Joseph, her husband, being a just man, and not wanting to make her a public example, was minded to put her away secretly. But while he thought about these things, behold, an angel of the Lord appeared to him in a dream, saying, Joseph, son of David, do not be afraid to take Mary your wife, for that which is conceived in her is of the Holy Spirit. And she will bring forth a son, and shall call his name Jesus, for he will save his people from their sins. So all this was done that it might be fulfilled, which was spoken by the Lord through the prophet, saying, behold, the virgin shall be with child and bear a son, and shall call his name Immanuel, which is translated God with us. So you see, Matthew knew what he was talking about after all. This could be understood as a footnote to a broader context. And oftentimes the writers of the New Testament used the Scriptures. They used particular verses as to call attention to a broader context. And in the broader context, the sign was not restricted to Ahaz, but would apply to the Davidic throne, the Davidic king later on, the people later on, through the Davidic king. So now here is the bottom line. I said earlier that I don't care whether or not it turns out that Rabbi Singer and people like him are correct about the use of this word translated virgin, whether in the Hebrew text or in the Septuagint. Doesn't matter with me. And here's why. You see, Matthew is not proof texting. We proof text. He wasn't. You know, we present some proposition. So this is my belief. Now I want you to blow the dust off your Bible and prove all things. And then we begin to line up proof text to try to show that what we're saying is true. That's not what Matthew is doing here. No. You see, Matthew has already had the experience of knowing Jesus Christ. He already knows these things. Here's someone who knows of the death and resurrection of Jesus. He knows of this man who predicted his own death and resurrection. And it came to pass. He knows about the miracles. He saw the miracles of Jesus. He heard the teachings of Jesus. He records them for us here in Matthew 5, 6, and 7. He tells his story. And he, of course, knew the Virgin Mary, and he knew this story. So Matthew is taking what he knows. He knew that the angel Gabriel had appeared to Mary. He knew that Jesus was conceived miraculously in the womb of this virgin. He knew that. So he's not looking for scriptures to proof text his belief. What he's doing is taking what he knows, what God has revealed to him and to many other men and women in that period of time, and he is now seeing deeper meaning in the Scriptures. And we see it over and over. As I said earlier, if I didn't know what I knew about the death of Christ, I doubt that I would connect the Passover with the prophecies about the Messiah. But now, knowing what I know, I can connect Passover, I can connect atonement, I can connect all kinds of things, as the writers of the New Testament did. You see, that's not proof texting. That's looking back at previous revelation and seeing the fullness of meaning within it. And that's what Matthew is doing right here. So was Matthew ignorant? Oh, no. He understood the context in which that prophecy was given. Understood it very clearly. And he applied it appropriately to the situation, to Jesus. For he knew that this was ultimately, the sign prophecy about Immanuel, ultimately pertained to him. And we see that throughout the New Testament. The same thing. Read the book of Hebrews sometime. Read the book of Hebrews and see how many references you have to Old Testament realities. The high priest, the sin offering, so many other things that are back there. And realize that what the writers of the New Testament are doing is they're looking at the truth God revealed to them through Jesus Christ, and now they're seeing the deeper revelation of those scriptures that they'd had all along. It's a glorious thing. It's a wonderful thing to be able to now look back, have the light of greater revelation, and look back and see the depths of the revelation God has previously given.